This is part of a series at Clackamas United Church of Christ called our Monday Faith Conversation series. And we have been watching sometimes TED Talks, sometimes other talks by theologians, progressive sermons, and then just having conversations about them. So usually a 15, 20-minute video, and then we'll just kind of discuss it. It's led to some really great conversations. One of our conversations moving into Holy Week dealt about the death of Jesus. And one of our members asked the question, well, if God is all powerful and all good, then why is there so much evil in the world? And I said, oh my goodness, you need to read Tom Oord, because Tom is the best theologian doing work on this question.
Oh, thank you.
And so I gave some book options and stuff. And then a couple of days later, Tom messages me and says, Adam, can I send you my book called Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence? So I was like, wow, this is perfect timing. Maybe there is a God. And thank you, Tom. So that is how this conversation came about. And Tom, as always, has been so generous with his time and with his intelligence. And Tom has, this is, I think, the third time Tom has worked with Clackamas UCC. We've interviewed Tom once before about another book called God Can't. And that's another fascinating book. Tom also, at the beginning of the pandemic, this will tell you all you need to know about Tom. Tom posted on his Facebook page, hey, I know that a lot of you pastors are under a lot of stress right now, and if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. So I messaged Tom right away and said, Tom, can you preach for me this Sunday? And Tom said, I would love to. So Tom did our sermon for that Sunday, which was a huge help for me. Tom is very generous spirit, and also very smart at talking about this important topic. So Tom, anything else people should know about you? Tom is
You're making me sound better than I am, Adam. So
Tom is Tom is the director for the Center of Open and Relational Theology and the doctoral students at Northwind Theological Seminary. He's the author of many, many books on science and religion, on theology. So Tom, I think with that, I've invited Tom to give us kind of a 20 to 30-minute talk on Omnipotence, kind of where Tom is at, kind of a summary maybe of the book, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from anybody who's got questions or comments that you would like to make. So everything is up for grabs here. Tom has heard all of the questions before, so you may have something new for Tom, or you may not. But we'll see how this goes. So I will make you the spotlight for everyone. Okay. And then Tom, whenever you are ready, feel free to go ahead and give us a start.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Adam, and thanks to all of you for joining in for this conversation. These are important topics and pretty controversial topics, at least in most circles. I've been thinking about the question posed by the person about, if there's a all-powerful and all-loving God, then why is there evil in the world? I've been thinking about that for a long time, as I'm guessing a lot of you have, and trying to formulate what I thought was the best overall answer. And that has kind of been played out in a couple of other books that I've written previously. Adam mentioned the book God Can't, which is written for a general audience. But there's also been some academic kind of books that I wrote, trying to argue that there's a God who exists, who's perfectly loving, and this love makes it the case that God simply can't control anyone or anything. I grew up in a tradition that emphasized free will, and I still believe in free will. And for a while, I thought that was sort of the answer to this question. God made a world and there's free will, and don't blame God for what the bad that happens, blame free will creatures. But I realized that answer didn't capture all of the good questions that I had. For instance, it doesn't seem like it's anybody's free will that spreads the pandemic. Pandemic doesn't seem to, viruses don't seem to have free will. So what about those? Or sometimes it seems like if God had the ability to override free will, then in really special cases, at least, God ought to use that. Wouldn't the world be a better place if God overrode free will of those who do horrific crimes? And so those kinds of questions begin to shape the way I think. I write these books that make these strong claims that a loving God simply can't prevent evil single-handedly. God is present and active, but can't. And I would say in the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of people have, taken on that message, found it helpful, but still kind of wondered some big questions. One question was, how does this God can't perspective fit with the Bible? Another one was, okay, maybe it can fit with the Bible, but is it like philosophically plausible? A third was, and one of the big reasons I wrote this book, people said, okay, I get it that you believe God can't prevent evil, but what can God do? Is God just sort of watching from a distance, or kind of like the glue of the universe that doesn't really do anything, but is present? I mean, how do we talk about what scholars call divine action, what God is really up to in the world? And so I thought in this new book, from the start, I had in my mind what I wanted. I had 4 chapters in my mind. I was going to look at the Bible. I was going to look at philosophy. Then I was going to do some of my questions of evil stuff, but kind of do some twists that I'd never done before. And then the big chapter at the end was to present a view of God that actually talks about what God actually does in the world, what God can and can't do. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to quickly go through those 4 chapters and then engage in some discussion with you all. On the Bible issue, before I wrote this book, I was convinced that there was nothing in the Bible that required people to believe God was all-powerful. There was nothing in the Bible that required us to think God was omnipotent, to use the classic language. Nothing said God completely controlled a creature or a situation. Now, I readily admitted that a lot of people came to the Bible believing God was omnipotent and then kind of read into the text these things. But I thought that was bad interpretation. It was interpreting the text based upon prior assumptions. But there was nothing in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, excuse me, or the New Testament, the Greek scriptures, that required belief in omnipotence. When I started writing, I knew also that the first word in the Old Testament that is translated God Almighty is a phrase called El Shaddai. But the vast majority of biblical scholars believe that Shaddai doesn't mean all-powerful. It means either breasts or mountains. Breasts that give nourishment, mountains that provide refuge. And if you look at the places in which Shaddai is used in the Old Testament, the context suggests those kinds of interpretations. So El Shaddai, the word that if you look in your Bibles is translated God Almighty, doesn't actually mean God Almighty. It's a mistranslation. But there's a second word that I really didn't know much about before writing this book, and it's another Hebrew word called Sabaoth. And that word means hosts or council or armies or a group. And when it's preceded by one of the Hebrew words that we translate God, like El or Adonai or Yahweh, translators have translated it Lord of hosts or God Almighty. Again, there's nothing about being the leader of a bunch of hosts that means that God is all powerful. But time and time again, if you look in your Bible, your English Bible, you'll find the word Almighty there. And in my research, actually, here's a little trivia tidbit. Every time the word Sabaoth appears in the Old Testament, and it's not preceded by a word that we translate God, El, Adonai, Yahweh, it's never translated as Almighty. It's always translated as hosts. But just every once in a while, El Sabaoth, or Yahweh Sabaoth, comes out Almighty. So I wanted to show that this was a real problem. Two major mistranslations. And it's not me just kind of proposing these things. I'm relying upon dozens and dozens of biblical scholars and their work to show this. The problem came in the history of Christianity when, in about the 3rd or 4th century BCE, a bunch of Greek Jews decided to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And when it came to those passages, El Shaddai and El Sabaoth, they chose a Greek word that is pantocrator. Pan meaning all, crater means something like holding. So they said God was all holding. When the New Testament is written, pantocrator ends up being present 10 times. 9 of them in the book of Revelation, and 1 time the Apostle Paul uses it. He's quoting from the Septuagint. And so pantocrator is very rare in the New Testament, but time and time again, English translators look at that word and give it the translation God Almighty, when it's a mistranslation of the Hebrew words. So I came through writing this chapter realizing that there was a lot more biblical support for my views and no biblical support for saying God is almighty or omnipotent. And I think that chapter it ended up being strong. I have a stronger case than I thought I had going in. The second chapter of the book is on philosophy. And I begin with a question I was asked as an undergraduate in college. My philosophy professor asked the class, can God make a rock so big even God can't lift it? It's a conundrum, and it prompts people to begin thinking carefully about what they mean when they say God can do something or can't do something. Well, it turns out that even the most conservative of Jews, Muslims, and Christians who believe that God is omnipotent qualify what they mean. They don't really mean God can do anything. They don't think God can do what is logically impossible. God can't, for instance, make a round square. God can also not make 2 + 2 = 873. Can't do mathematically impossible things. Can't do geometrically impossible things. Can't make a square rectangle. All these kinds of things. Almost every single major theologian says, yep, an omnipotent God can't do that. And then the question is, are there some things that God can't do because of God's nature? So in scripture, we read things like God can't tell a lie, or God can't deny himself. God can't be tempted. God can't grow tired. All these are biblical passages that say these things. And it turns out that there's lots of things God can't do because God is God. For instance, if you think God is omnipresent, God can't be absent from Las Vegas. If you think God is everlasting, God can't decide to die tomorrow and cease existing. And then there's some really interesting things, like if God is a spirit without an actual divine body, God can't pick up rocks. And what's even wilder is there are lots of things you and I can do that God can't. For instance, you and I can sin, and apparently God can't. Or you and I can chew licorice, but God doesn't have teeth to chew licorice. Now, you know, many Christians, and I'm one of them, thinks that God can call upon us to use our bodies and we can be God's metaphorical hands and feet. But I also think we have free will. And so we have to cooperate. We have to freely choose to be God's metaphorical hands and feet. So the big idea of that second chapter is captured in this phrase: omnipotence dies a death of 1,000 qualifications. In other words, people who say God is omnipotent, if they're smart at least, they qualify it over and over and over again until it's, you know, what's the meaning of the word anymore? Does it really have any value? And what's really weird is omnipotent is supposed to be a word that means without limits. And yet we have to provide all these limits to make any sense of it. So the crux of that chapter is that we should stop calling God omnipotent, because everybody who does, and who does at least intellectually in a sophisticated way, qualifies it to death. Third chapter. Here I hit the issues of evil again. And I'm doing a little bit of repetition from my previous work because I'm saying if there is an omnipotent God who is all powerful, who can control people or situations, and if this God is perfectly loving, this God should be preventing the genuine evils of the world, the pointless pain, the unnecessary suffering. And yet we all live our lives as if some things occur that are unnecessary, that are pointless, that are genuine evils. So we can either stop believing there's a God, we can stop thinking God is all loving, or I think we ought to stop thinking God is all powerful. And I give 6 reasons for this, or 6 sort of, I should say that differently. I give 6 answers to the problem of evil. I say God can't prevent evil single-handedly. God suffers with those who suffer. God works to try to squeeze something good out of the bad God didn't want in the first place. God calls upon you and me to work with God to bring something good into the world. So we have a real role to play. God tries to heal when there's sin and suffering, but God can't heal single-handedly. And the last, God is a creator, but never starts from absolute nothing and can't create out of absolute nothing in the present. And all of that then leads to the final chapter. That's where I coin a new word, amipotence. AMI is ami, the Latin word for love, and then potence, the Latin word for power. And the idea is that God's power is the power of love. In fact, uncontrolling love. And love comes first before power. So another way to say it is we should understand God's power in the light of God's love. If we start talking about God's power in ways that somehow undermine God's love, portray God as unloving, then we need to rethink our view of power to align with the primacy of love. And I pick on a few people in the tradition and who are alive today who I don't think do a good job of putting love first in their doctrine of God. And I conclude that chapter by making some really wild claims about how a God who is a universal loving spirit is active at all times and all places, really influencing everyone and everything, but never controlling and requiring a positive response from creation or the conditions of inanimate creation to be aligned for good to thrive in the world. And in fact, I think this idea of God acting as a universal spirit and creatures responding actually gives us a plausible account of what we find in Scripture, of both the miraculous we see today, but also the lack of miracles. The healings we sometimes see, whether it's through modern medicine or unexpected natural healings, and the lack of healing we sometimes see. This universal spirit of love is active throughout all of creation. Right now, as I'm speaking and you're listening, all the time. And anything good that happens in the world, anything that's beautiful, true, and loving, has God as its source and some kind of creaturely response or cooperation. Everything that's evil in the world has God acting, but creatures or creation not responding well. And because God is uncontrolling, not omnipotent, God can't control anyone or anything. So that's the outline of the whole book. I'm sure you've got some questions and you would like me to probe deeper maybe in some areas, but that's the gist of it. And I look forward to our conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Tom. And we've already got a quick start in the chat section for questions and comments. And I like to bring people in. Oh, there we go. There. Okay. So now it's easier to see everybody. So let's see. Our first question comes from Eric. Eric, can you unmute yourself and you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh yeah, that was just what I was thinking of, another way of like phrasing what Tom was saying about what amipotence means.
Love is true power. That's what you're thinking, Eric. So, Tom, would you say amipotence is could be defined as love is true power, or is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I would say amipotence is God's power expressed as love. And since I think God always loves, in fact, God must love because it's God's nature, everything God does is an act of love. But because so many in the Christian tradition could agree with what I just said and say, of course, God is always loving. God is loving when God kills the Canaanites. God is loving when God, allows my sister's rape. These things make no sense to me. I want to say God's love is always uncontrolling. So God doesn't allow rape as if God could stop it single-handedly. God's not in the business of killing Canaanites. Instead, God's in the business of always loving everywhere, all the time, but always in an uncontrolling way.
I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that I often come up against when I start preaching on social media that God is love, people will say, "Yeah, but don't dismiss God's wrath."
Yeah.
Right. So what,
Yeah.
like there has to be a tension within God between God's ultimate love and God's ultimate wrath, as if
Yeah.
they're in like some kind of competition or something with each other. What do you do with that?
Well, I think wrath is just a way of talking about God being angry when we hurt each other. I actually believe in divine wrath, but I don't think wrath is divine punishment. I don't think God is taking out a big spanking or switch and going to hit you on the backside when you do something wrong. I think there are natural negative consequences that come from sin. But I think what some people, the problem with, or the reason people will say, well, God is loving, but also wrathful, or in my religious tradition, it's very common for people to say, God is loving, but also holy.
Yeah.
Is that what they have in mind for love is kind of like a passive, wimpy, anything goes relativism, like, oh, I just don't want to step on your toes. And that's what they think love is. And my view of love is acting for well-being. You can be an activist and be loving. In fact, I think that's kind of the point. So it's not a wimpy kind of activity. It's doing things that really make a difference. And in my way of thinking, people who talk about God being both holy and loving are kind of being repetitive. I don't think there's such a thing as unholy love. If God really is loving, God is holy as well.
Good. There are some in my circles who want to just do away with power language altogether.
Yeah, I'm not in that camp.
It just gets so abused. Say more about that, how you're not.
Yeah, I'm not in that camp. I understand why people want to say that, at least initially, because the word power for them means something like control or force or overpowering. But, I think Martin Luther King was right. You can't have love without power. Love is an act of power, but it's a power for good, for well-being. And you don't want power without love, but also love is inherently active and powerful.
Good. Thank you. Jeff, do you want to bring in your duplicate comment here?
Sorry, Princess and I got off on a tangent there. No, this is just a quibble from a mathematician.
Good.
I know that you know better, Tom. 180 degrees in a triangle on a Euclidean flat plane surface only.
I should have been better with my example. Sorry.
Jeff is our mathematician and uses words like Euclidean all the time, and it just makes me so happy. So, all right. So now we're going to get into the big questions, and Dina is one of our members who has been coming since the beginning. We started this, asking these kinds of really great questions. So Dina, do you want to hop in and ask this question?
Yeah. My question I've had since forever is, God created everything, even if they didn't create it out of nothing. Even I tend to look at it like when God said, let there be light, that was the singularity and expansion began in the universe, that kind of thing, right? God that can create everything, including us, has no power to do anything to stop the cray cray in the world, to stop children from killing children. And I don't want to get into all that, but how does that work? I mean, did they just like, okay, I'm done now and I'm out of power. Now I'm just going to sit back and love the crap out of everybody? I don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great
I mean,
question. Yeah, that's a great question. My answer may strike you as radical. I don't
hit
think
me.
when people call God a creator, they usually have in mind that God single-handedly brought about some result. And they usually think that 13.8 billion years ago, God was all alone and decided to say, boom, let there be light, or Big Bang, or whatever. And that began an evolutionary process. And either God's still involved or sits back or whatever. I think God never creates single-handedly. That even at the Big Bang, God is working in relation to chaos of a previous universe. And that's important because that means that God's creating is always a cooperative venture. God never has an absolutely blank slate. And that means that God didn't, unilaterally put into place all the conditions of creation, and perhaps more importantly, can't create it from absolute nothing in the present. In this book, I talk a little bit about that when I quote one of the most influential philosophers of the last 100 or at least 50 years, a guy named Alvin Plantinga. He believes in creation out of nothing. And in one of his books, he says, God has the ability right now to instantaneously create a full-grown horse in Times Square. And I think if we follow the logic of omnipotence and creation out of nothing, Plantinga is right. But I reject the logic of omnipotence and reject the logic of creation out of nothing. I do think God is a creator, but I don't think that creating is ever unilateral, ever single-handed, ever done all alone. So maybe a better way, a better analogy is to talk about the kind of creating a parent might do with a child. If, wise parents know they can't control their children, but they can try to coax them, persuade them, try to lead them in the right direction. And when they're doing that, they really are creating their children in particular ways, but it's not them all alone. And if we take that analogy and apply it to God, and even apply it down to the quarks, I think we have a better understanding of how God is a creator.
Okay, so when God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, is that just, oh crap, I forgot the word, hyperbole in the Bible?
Yeah.
Adam likes
Great
the word
question.
hyperbole.
Yeah. I think it's a way of God talking about being everlasting. I think it's a way,
Okay.
I think God is the beginning of our universe, and I think our universe will someday end. And so God will be literally the Alpha and the Omega, but God preceded the universe and will go beyond our universe. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
Okay, and then so what's the point in praying then? Why should we bother praying?
Okay, that's turning really far the other direction, but I'm going to answer it. I love
fine.
that. I love that question. Is it okay if I give you I'm going to give you a 3 or 4 minute response because it's so important. I think prayer makes far more sense from the perspective I'm going to present to you than from any other perspective I know, including traditional ones. And to try to explain what I mean, I want to explore 3 models of prayer and then propose my 4th model. Okay. And when I talk about prayer, I'm guessing we're here talking about specifically petitionary prayer, asking God to do something and how is God going to respond, that kind of thing. There's lots of kinds of prayers, but that's what I'm assuming we're talking about. So model number 1, we'll call it the Calvinist model.
Yeah.
God has decided from all eternity, has predestined and foreknown absolutely everything that's ever going to happen. Now, if you really believe that's the case, why would you ever pray and ask God to do something in the future? Because the future's already been settled. It's already been decided. Your prayer is not going to affect God's action one whit because everything is predetermined. Very few people actually believe in the first model of prayer. Even Calvinists today pray like God's might respond. The second model, we'll call it a more Arminian model, is the most common one, at least in the circles I'm in. It says God does have omnipotent power. God could single-handedly fix any problem out there. But God sometimes sits back, metaphorically at least, arms folded, and says, look, unless you ask me, unless you beg, unless you pray 37 times, I'm not going to get off my butt and do anything. I mean, at least that's the way it sounds, right? Some of the passages of scripture that people use, at least the way they interpret them, sound as if God's not going to act until we ask. But is that really a loving picture of God?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. You know, imagine I'm at the lake and one of my daughters is out in the lake and starts to drown, and I can see she's going to go under, but suppose she's flailing around and she can't call out for help. Am I going to say, well, you know, she didn't ask me, I'm not going to jump in? No, of course not. I'm a loving father. I'm going to try to rescue her. I'm not more loving than God. So I think if God is truly loving and omnipotent, then God ought to up and solve these problems, even if we never ask. And yet that doesn't seem to be the case.
Right.
So people who hear those, or who at least think through those first two models, usually opt for a third one. And this is more progressive Christians have this third model. They give up on the idea that their prayer is actually going to make a difference to God. And they'll say, well, prayer doesn't change God, it only changes me. Now, I think there's some truth to the idea that prayer can change us. But the fourth model, the one I want to advocate, it actually says our prayers make a difference to God. And it presupposes the idea that God moves through time with us moment by moment, and that what we do at one moment affects God and opens up new opportunities and avenues for God in the next moment, such that our prayers really make a difference to God, ourselves, and the world. Our prayers never make it the case that God can control others, because God doesn't have that kind of power, in my view. God is not omnipotent. But just like the way you and I influence each other moment by moment, and that influence has real effects in how we act in the subsequent moments, so too we can have a real effect upon God in our praying and our acting and whatever we do. So this model of prayer says our actions and prayers can make a real difference, but God is never controlling.
Excellent.
Sorry for the long answer, but
No,
I thought you might want to see the comparison there.
I love it. I love
A
it.
nice cat too.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm trying to keep them off me and it's not working.
That happens.
Yeah.
Thank you for that explanation. I think that's something I'm going to have to sit and think about. I often think, and I think in our group here, we often say things like, God, we ask God, why are you letting this happen? God asks us, why are you letting this happen?
Yeah.
And that's been my view. I was raised in the Baptist church, so you can imagine the caca I come from.
Yep.
And I've come a long way, and you have just opened up a whole new way of looking at everything for me, and it's going to take a while for me to absorb it.
Totally makes sense. Yep.
But thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Dina. Jen, I love the way that you bring up prayer and talk about it here in this comment. You've got two comments in there, Jen. So I want to bring you in for this prayer comment, if you want to read it for us and have any other reflections, and also for the other comment that you made in the chat section too. So Jen, if you'd like to go ahead and hop on in, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, so a slightly different take on your fourth idea. there, Dr. Ward. What I said was prayer is an intention of activating the potential of grace for all of us as co-creators to participate in whatever blessing that we're perceiving. So I really do see that the relational aspect of God's lovingness being more manifest, or that potential for that lovingness to be manifested more profoundly is powerful. And I think the more people who pray for something, the more potential can become manifested. I think that the importance of prayer, to attend to Dina's earlier question, is that without it, we lose hope. If we believe in our own powerlessness, and we believe in God's powerlessness. And I think that I don't want to say that if God wanted to get off God's butt, God could do anything. What I would suggest is that when we and God are able to harmonize our intentions in a way that is has a focus on creating blessing and holiness, that presence of holiness, that inspires more hopefulness, which becomes more helpful.
Yeah, I don't see what you're saying in that comment, or what you just said verbally, as an alternative to what I said. I see it as part of it. I see us on the same
Okay.
team here. So, yeah.
That's good.
So my previous comment is just looking at the whole kind of time frame of stories. Sometimes we don't know where we are in a story. Adam brought another speaker to us talking about this idea that stories change, and since we don't know where we are in the story, we don't know whether there is, whether an act, a chapter might be good or evil. And so this idea about God not being present in evil, or as evil or destruction is taking place, I think is a little potentially suggests I don't like the idea of suggesting the absence of God ever.
I'm totally with you. Yeah. I
Yeah.
agree.
So yeah, I think that it's helpful for me to keep a perspective that even when things feel super awful, and where despair just seems to be winning, God is still present. God is still there.
Yeah.
And
Maybe I
that is,
misspoke. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I must have misspoke there, because I didn't want to get the impression that God is ever absent. But I
Yeah.
did want to give the impression that God can be present, but creatures not cooperate well with God. And that's where I think we get into problems. So God's always
I think
there.
that's, yeah. And I think that sometimes we get confused about what cooperation looks like.
Sure.
Yeah, and we can let our fears get in control of what we think cooperating with God's will looks like. And so that's the idea where people will commit evil on behalf of what they think is a greater good. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah. I agree with you.
Good.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for that, Jen. Yeah. I want to get let's see. Janice, you've got some really good comments in here. What is God? Janice, I'd love for you to unmute yourself if you want to read your question and bring that in. That would be great.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear
Yes.
you.
Yeah, so my background is, well, I grew up in an old German Lutheran church,
Nice.
and total fire and brimstone, because they settled north of Milwaukee in Freistadt in Wisconsin, the oldest German community but I never could relate to any of that. And it was always scary, fire and brimstone, and I was so sinful, and I just I couldn't do it. And so
Yeah.
and I became pretty anti-organized religion for ever and ever and ever, for all kinds of reasons. But then I found this community of people, and I'm intrigued with all the deconstruction. I love deconstructing things.
Yeah.
Now, so for me, my well, I know people who've they've died and come back, and they had these experiences that they talk about, and they become, oh my God, they're so spiritual now. And then I read a lot, and I listen to a lot of people, and they say that, they have this experience of all this beautiful, peaceful, vibratory love, and it's all encompassing, and they can't, our words at this dimension of reality can't express what they felt. And I remember when my mom passed away, I was with her, and I could tell that some of her, like the people she just loved the most, were kind of like, I could sense their essence in the room. And when she left her body, the whole space filled up with this palpable peace that I had never felt before. And I wanted to hang on to that. And then it reminds me of what people say who said like they left their bodies and they were having these amazing experiences and really didn't want to come back, but needed to. So then I do need, when people say God, I don't know, I don't really, it sounds like we talk about God as if there's like human qualities to God, but my sense is, I don't know, do people do that? I don't understand the Bible and all the different translations. How was God originally translated? What were the original translations of, what is this? Like a creative, loving, peaceful, vibratory essence that imbues everything, rock, soil, earth, bird, sky, air, bodies, cells. So what is, what is
You got an
what is
easy
God
question.
in this? How do you describe God in this theology?
Yeah, I
So
love
then
it.
is it also kind of personal? People just kind of create their own thing?
Yeah,
And
you got so
ethically
many
for
good
me, it's
questions.
like, yeah. So
Thank
anyway,
you,
I'm just so
Janice.
curious. I just know what it was back in the fire and brimstone days.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I'm from the holiness tradition. We had a lot of fire and brimstone in my growing up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was unfortunate. Like I was confirmed, but I had no idea. I was kind of like mouthing the whole thing. None of it made sense to me. So anyway, I just help me out here because I do like
Yeah,
going
well,
to the
let me
origin of language, what people were trying to capture originally, because I realized there's so much mistranslation.
Yeah, I don't
Thank
think
you.
when it comes to God, it's going to help us to go back to original language. I think everybody's always grasping to try to make sense of God, and nobody's getting it perfectly right, even the original scriptures. So maybe I'll try to answer your question by first stating, I'm not sure what God is. Let me make that clear right up front. But maybe the
Okay.
best way to answer that is to talk to you a little bit about my own journey in asking that question and where I've come to at present without making any claims about how I've got God figured out, because I don't. Like you, when I was younger, I thought God was basically a bigger version of a human, a male with long hair and a beard, who had a deep voice, who was mostly pissed at me for masturbating. That was the kind of God I had in mind.
You
And
simple
that
creature.
and that just, that kind of was with me. It was basically a bigger version of my parents. I mean, I had loving parents, but I was worried about my parents being disappointed with me and when I disobeyed. So it was kind of a bigger version of my dad. That's what God was. But as I grew, I started adding more dimensions and it got more complex. And by the time I got in graduate school, I had left all of that personal God being stuff behind. And my view of God was what in the technical language is called the ground of being, or kind of like the Force in Star Wars. It really didn't do anything other than it was there. And everybody kind of appealed to it because they thought they had to have something to explain why we're here at all. But it was this impersonal force field. And as I thought about my deepest intuitions, and those intuitions being around love, and my thinking that if there is such a being called God, who is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, to use the classical language of Anselm, then why couldn't I think that this God was loving? And if this God was loving, if I started with love, and love seemed to be a relational kind of giving and receiving that sought the good of the others, that had an emotional element, yes, but not controlled by emotions, that had elements of sometimes self-sacrifice, but other times self-gratification. Nothing wrong with pleasure as long as it doesn't hurt other people. And I started thinking through these things, I came back to a view of God that actually has some biblical linkage. I'm not saying everything in the Bible supports it, but it was a view that said God is something like a spirit who's present everywhere, who loves everyone and everything, and not only giving, but also receiving, this relationality. And, I realized I had to throw out omnipotence. I had to throw out God being outside of time, which is what I was taught as a kid. I had to throw out the idea that God knows the future. I had to throw out the idea of hell. I had to throw out all these kind of ideas that had been told to me in the past, but I found out really I could get rid of them pretty easily and still like the Bible, at least the good parts. And this was the kind of God that I came up with in the end that I think is plausible, like it's philosophically defensible. It fits my deep intuitions and doesn't conflict with science, and actually motivates me to be a more loving person. I don't know if it's right or not, but it's the most plausible view I know of. And so I'm going to go with it.
Love it. Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Janice. Thank you. Thank you. JX, want to bring you in. And if you want to unmute yourself and bring in your question and your comment, I think that would be great.
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah, I wrote a lot in the box, and then I
Okay.
had to stop myself. Yeah, because a lot of what everybody is saying, including yourself, is like sending me into an ADHD overload. But basically, I want to say is that it sort of reminds me. I used to ask my friend all the time, why doesn't the Bible have a third testament? And when I say that, I mean that to say is that I'm an IT person, and in the computer world and slash video game world, there's a lot of talk about stepping outside of yourself in the game itself and seeing universes, as scientists would say, cosmologists would say.
Yeah.
And trying to get an idea of parallel universes, multiverses, and even pluralism in a sense. And everybody buckle up, I'm going to get a little philosophical here.
Here we go.
When it comes to pluralism and relativity, where all these, like I remember hearing singularity earlier, we're all these walking singularities among one another. And it gets me thinking that we all experience these moments of truth in reality, and then we slide back into the past or the future, depending on whatever situation's going on at the time with each other or with nature itself. And I haven't mentioned God yet, simply because we seem to be dealing with ourselves. And when that doesn't happen, then we look for God in whichever direction. And so I think my question is, what do you think about that in and of itself? I heard you mention dimensions. And to wrap all that up in a bow, I'm trying to put it in a bow.
Okay.
Basically, I'm wondering if God had these ideas and then suddenly God decided to work with woman. And working with woman, now we have a choice. Love is possible once we involve women.
Yeah.
But the physical aspect of God is a woman. I tend to think because of the birthing process. I think men, we can, identifying as a man, we can give birth spiritually. Identifying as woman, we give birth materialistically, so to speak. And so what if God gave birth to woman and woman gives birth to humanity, in turn going back to God?
Yeah, I really like your notion of God interacting with the creaturely realm.
Yes.
I'm a little, I'm a little non-binary and I have gender fluidity kinds of things. So I'm reluctant to say man, female, that sort of stuff. But I love the idea that God is interacting with this creaturely other in a generative kind of way. And both God and the other, in this case, you're talking about the woman, are mutually intertwined in such a way that something new is generated from that. That is at the heart of how I understand reality itself.
Yes.
So, everything you're saying, I might sort of use slightly different language, but I think you and I are on the same page here. The way we're thinking about God as intertwined with the material world.
And I think, thank you for saying that. And I think along with that intertwined aesthetic invites us to have a better insight on the things that are fluid and non-binary.
Yes, oh, definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because that's the direction that I think we say we're going into, that new direction. I think that's where we began.
Nice. Yeah.
So we've made a full circle now. Why? Because the conversation has finally started to happen out in the reality of humanity, so to speak. God is non-binary.
Yep, I'm with you.
Love it.
Thank you.
So and those who identify as non-binary have some sort of understanding that it predates our current understanding.
Yeah, I mean, if you take evolutionary history seriously, there was long stretches of period in which there were no genders, right?
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that gender is all a myth. It may be socially constructed, but it still can be a real thing.
Yes.
But I'm a person who thinks we should understand it in terms of spectrums and fluidity rather than rigid, two options kind of a thing.
Yes, I think my final point on that, because I could sit here and talk to all y'all.
Good.
But I think that somebody mentioned deconstruction. I'm a deconstruction person too. I'm also a construction and reconstruction person as well.
Good, yeah.
And so I think that as long as humanity, we keep an idea of what's real, then we could rest assured that we can start thinking about things that float around our reality, so to speak, with the drifts between past and future.
I like that a lot, JX. I like that a lot. I'm also a person who thinks that reconstruction is important, but I recently talked with someone who we were talking about deconstruction and reconstruction,
Yeah.
and they thought I meant that you deconstruct meant you tear down the ideas you had, and reconstruct meant you went right back to those same ideas. And I was like,
no,
I don't believe that. And I'm pretty sure JX doesn't believe it in this conversation. No. But yeah, there's also a constructive move that I think we want to do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Even Jesus didn't throw out the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, when we talk about absolutism, I want to keep the rules. I want to keep the law. However, it's time for something new.
Yeah.
That's good.
It's time to remember what this means and how the laws help, not hinder us.
Yep.
Beautiful.
Preach it, my friend. Preach it.
Yeah.
We're coming sort of down. We're usually an hour. Tom, can you stay with us a little bit longer?
Yep, no problem.
Okay.
No problem.
We've got some comments. I will read the comments from people who have already spoken. And then if you haven't spoken, I will invite you to come in because we would love to hear your voice too. Jen says, I like this. This is kind of the evolution of religion that we're looking at here. Jen says, it may be important to note that early humans needed a god who could or would control weather, fertility, animal migration, fire, etc. Do you see any in that evolution of religion, a god who controls early on in human history and where we're at now, what you're telling us about now?
Yeah, I think that was a strong inclination by many people early on. And then they ran into problems because, God could control these things theoretically, but it didn't mesh with their view that God was also benevolent, loving, a God of covenant. And so I think we're always in the midst of trying to rework our views of God.
Yeah, good. Eric says different biblical authors had different ideas too.
Yep.
Out of trying to understand with less developed language, less developed philosophy, and less developed theology. Hence, Israel, meaning wrestles with God.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it's why we can draw from wisdom in the past without thinking the past has everything, but also being humble by saying we don't have it all yet either. So we're in a process.
Yeah, that's good. It's also one of the things that deconstruction has really helped me with is to understand that there is not one voice in the Bible.
Right.
It's the scholarly word for this is that the Bible isn't univocal. It doesn't have one voice. It has multiple voices. As Eric says, people trying to wrestle with who God is. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they disagree and have some pretty serious debates, right?
Yep. Yep.
Good. Okay. Gail says, Tom, why are you leaving us here with tons of questions and no concrete answers? Gail, do you want to come in? Gail, do you want to come in and say a little more about this? Gail is where are you, Gail? I don't see you. Anyway, Gail, if you want to, there you are, Gail. If you want to unmute yourself and come on in and say a little bit more if you'd like. You want to say anything more, Gail?
I can respond if Gail doesn't want to elaborate.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Just an answer, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Gail, I want to avoid two extremes. One extreme is me coming in with all the concrete answers as if I got everything figured out. That's not me. On the other hand, I want to avoid having no proposals whatsoever. I want to avoid just being the one who deconstructs every possible answers and leaves you with nothing. At the end of the day, I have some proposals. I don't know if they're right or not, but at the heart of my proposal is the belief that there actually is a God of the universe who is a spirit of love present throughout all of reality. A lot more needs to be said than that, but that's where my starting point is. As it's a proposal, I don't know for sure if that's the case, but that's my offer.
Good, good. Nancy, I want to bring you in. Nancy, do you want to read your comment and maybe say a little bit more? There we go.
My point was simply that when we think about images of God and try to figure out who God is, what God is, etc., we're limited to our own perceptions, which come to us through our senses. We have a certain amount of cerebral brain power, and we can get abstract with metaphor and simile. But I think it might be to our benefit that we can't actually nail that down.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. I think the frustration over trying to do that is kind of misplaced energy.
Nice.
I like the diversity and the fluidity and the knowledge that I can never be in control of that because I'm simply not designed to be. I'm not capable of that.
Yeah, I like it.
I'm good with the mystery.
Good, good. We've got a lot of comments here. I'm trying to sift through them. Jeff asks, do you think God created or creates mathematics?
No, I do not. How's that for a direct answer? Got concrete one there. No, I'm in agreement with, I think the majority of people in the Christian tradition and Islam and Judaism who are Platonists, who think that the principles of mathematics are eternal. Now, I think they're in the mind of God. So it's not like, they were somewhere before God existed. God's always existed. But I think mathematics, geometry, possibilities are everlastingly in the mind of God. God never created them, but they also didn't create God. They're just part of God's everlasting or eternal mind.
Good, good. And
So in
ahead.
other words, not something that's being invented on the fly by mathematicians.
That's right. I think mathematicians discover. I don't think they invent.
Would you approve, Jeff? Would you approve that answer?
Yeah, I think that's close to what I think.
Yeah, that's close. That's awesome. Jen says, I love the feminism here. And starting off, we have one of our prelude songs is goes off of El Shaddai. And whenever we do that, I always like to say, okay, this is the many-breasted one. And
Yeah.
glad you are here, Tom, to tell everybody that I'm correct.
That's
with
right.
regards to theology. So Shekinah. Jen says Shekinah, wisdom woman, was with God before the founding of the world, according to Proverbs. So this is good ancient Hebrew God as feminine language here.
Yes, definitely. Which is why even language about Trinity is always relativistic. If we took
Mhm.
wisdom seriously, we should say there's more than just 3 dimensions of God. I don't want to steer us off into a discussion of the Trinity, but I'm just simply saying there's many aspects of God, and some of them are very feminine in their origin or language. And often the tradition has just up and ignored those, even though they're right there in the biblical text.
Beautiful.
Even worse, let me complain a little more. Even worse, they've taken words that are in their Hebrew or in their Greek are feminine in their form, and taken male or gender neutral English words to translate them. And that really pisses me off. But anyway, I won't get
That's good.
going here.
Eric says omnigendered. Is that something we could say about God? That's one at least omni that God is, right?
Yeah. I think some people want to say God is all genders. Other people want to say God is genderless. I'm kind of more on the genderless side, but I think God has all the positive characteristics we typically ascribe to the various genders.
Beautiful. Let's see. Steve, you've got your virtual hand raised, so thank you for doing that. Go ahead, Steve.
I would just like to ask Tom a question. First, I really appreciate the information and what you've given us here, Tom.
Yeah.
But on a personal note for yourself, I would ask, what have you concluded that God requires of you?
Beautiful question. First and foremost, I don't know this for sure because I don't even know if there's a God for sure. I'm living my life as if there is one, but I'm not positive. I think God wants me and probably all of you to live lives of love. I think that's the purpose and goal of my life. Now, what that looks like for me is probably going to look a little different from you. It's definitely going to look different from the way a bird might love or a worm might love, or, et cetera. So love has a plural form of expressions. But I think God's ultimate purpose and call in my life is to live a life of love.
Good. Thank you, Tom. Thank you. We've got 36 new messages according to Zoom. So we've got a very active chat section.
Good.
I'm not going to be able to get to them, but if you haven't spoken yet, please raise your virtual hand and we will bring you in. But I want to get this question. The next question that I see here is from Dina, who asks, what happens when we die?
All right, since we don't have a lot of time, I'm gonna not go through all the options and go straight to my own personal belief.
Good.
I believe in life after death. I think we continue to have subjective experience after our brains and bodies begin to decay. We earlier were talking about near-death experiences. There's also out-of-body experiences. I take those seriously. I don't know exactly what it's going to be like in the afterlife. I mean, I don't even know partially what it's going to be like, but I think that we can continue to have subjective experience beyond bodily death. And in that experience, God is moment by moment inviting us to join in the work of love as these minds or spiritual bodies, to use Paul's language. I don't know how that all works, and we can choose to cooperate with God in the afterlife or not. I don't believe in a literal hell. I don't believe God forces everybody into heaven, but I do believe God never, ever, ever gives up on anybody and consistently calls us to love moment by moment. It's theoretically possible, and it's my hope that everyone and everything capable of responding to God positively will respond to God positively. That's, I think, the ultimate reconciliation of all things, to use Pauline language.
I love it. Good stuff. Let's see. Jessica, you made a comment here thanking Tom. Would you like to come on in and give a little testimony?
Sure. I just have really appreciated this conversation and everything that you shared, Tom, about your book. I'm a big fan of God Can't.
Oh,
And
great.
it felt like it just clearly explained things that just intuitively felt true to me in my life. And not to get into specifics, but I'm a complex PTSD survivor. I've experienced a great many things, and a really important part of my healing is the belief that God has been with me, is with me, always will be with me in whatever I go through, and that God is with those who have harmed me at those times. And the belief that God calls to everybody away from causing harm to others, that God doesn't exist in the actions that hurt me, but God is with that person. That actually gives me a lot of hope to know that even when I was being hurt, God was with me to help me get through those moments. And also with those people, even as they were making big mistakes. That makes me feel like there's opportunity for all of us. There's a chance for all of us, whichever side we're landing on, that there is a way to, like, as you've framed it, sort of cooperatively engage with God, and that is a just consistent, ongoing invitation that we have, and it has been really powerful for me. So thank you so much.
Oh, that makes me feel so good for you to say that. And the way you articulated it was so beautiful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I messed up. Gail, you were the one who asked the question on what happens after we die. And I think I attributed that to someone else. So Gail, thank you for that.
Well, Deanna had asked, but you didn't answer right away. So I wanted to make sure he answered, because I have the same question.
Good. Okay. So I'm right. I gave credit to both of you. So that's fantastic. Awesome.
Thank you.
So, good. All right. Well, Tom, thank you so much for this conversation and for being here and for being so gracious. And you must have been like working with God in that moment when you reached out to me with your new book, because it led to all of this. So God was inviting you into that apparently, and here we are. So thank you
for the opportunity. I mean, it was fun talking about the book. In our conversations in the Q&A, we went a lot of different directions, and it makes me think that maybe I ought to mention another book that might be of interest to folks. That's simply called Open and Relational Theology: An Introduction to Life-Changing Ideas. And it's written at the level of God Can't, so it's like written for everybody. You don't have to be a trained theologian to get the language, but it addresses a lot of the questions that you guys have been asking, because they're really good questions, from the perspective of an open and relational theology.
Yes, that's another good book. I have it right here.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
It's only 150 pages, and the text is pretty big too. So,
yeah, that's right.
so it's a good quick read with some really in-depth stuff on these questions. So thank you everybody for being here. We do have our Bible study tomorrow that's at 3:30 Pacific. So if you'd like to join us for that, feel free. It's the same Zoom link if you want to join us tomorrow for that. So friends, with that, I hope you have a great rest of your evening.